Chapter 1. The Summer Fete and the Fallen Bell. St. Alderwick lay among gentle hills and narrow hedgerows in the summer of 1958. The village was neither remarkable nor famous. Its church tower rose above a cluster of brick cottages, and the high street contained exactly the sort of establishments one expected: a post office, a butcher, a grocer, a tea room, and Hawthorne's bakery, whose warm scent of fresh bread drifted through the village every morning before sunrise. On the last Saturday of July, the annual summer fete occupied every conversation. Bunting stretched across the village green. Children rehearsed races. Elderly ladies arranged flower displays with the seriousness of military planners. The church choir prepared for an afternoon performance. Miss Jane Marple arrived shortly after 11 o'clock. She had come from St. Mary, Mead, to spend several weeks with an old acquaintance, Mrs. Edith Fairchild, whose cottage overlooked the green. Miss Marple settled herself comfortably beneath a striped parasol and observed the preparations with pleasant interest. People often assumed she was merely enjoying the sunshine. That assumption suited her perfectly. "You've chosen an excellent day," said Mrs. Fairchild. "Indeed, the entire village will be here." Miss Marple smiled. "That is often very useful." Mrs. Fairchild laughed. "Useful for what?" "For understanding people." The answer appeared so innocent that Mrs. Fairchild merely nodded. By noon, the green had become crowded. Children ran between stalls. A brass band performed enthusiastic versions of popular tunes. Women displayed cakes, preserves, and embroidery. Men organized raffles and games of chance. The vicar moved about, attempting to appear calm while quietly worrying about every detail. Among the crowd was Clara Hawthorne. Many villagers considered Clara the heart of Hawthorne's bakery. Her husband, Walter Hawthorne, baked the bread, but Clara remembered every customer's preferences, every birthday, every family difficulty. If someone lost employment, Clara somehow knew before anyone else. If a marriage was failing, Clara sensed it months before gossip confirmed it. People spoke freely around her, perhaps too freely. At 38, she possessed a pleasant face, intelligent eyes, and an expression that suggested she listened far more than she spoke. That afternoon, she stood behind the bakery stall selling currant buns and fruit loaves. Several villagers stopped to chat. Among them was Leonard Pierce. Pierce owned a prosperous transport company and was generally regarded as the wealthiest man in St. Alderwick. He was 56, broad-shouldered, and habitually confident. Many admired him, many disliked him. Almost nobody trusted him completely. "Good turnout," he said. "Excellent turnout," Clara replied. Pierce lowered his voice. "I've been meaning to ask after your husband. He's very well." "Good, good," he hesitated. Clara's smile remained unchanged. For a brief moment, something uncomfortable passed between them. Then Pierce laughed loudly and moved away. Miss Marple happened to notice the exchange. She continued knitting. Nearby, another observer had noticed it as well. That observer was Sergeant Malcolm Reed. The village policeman watched crowds by instinct. He noticed disagreements. He noticed nervous glances. He noticed people who abruptly changed subjects. His attention lingered on Pierce and Clara for several seconds before a group of children distracted him. The afternoon continued pleasantly. At 2 o'clock, the flower competition concluded. At 3, the brass band performed. At 4, the church bell committee announced a fundraising ceremony. The old church bell, cracked beyond repair, was to be replaced. The replacement had arrived weeks earlier. It now stood on a decorated wooden platform near the church entrance. The vicar intended to unveil a commemorative plaque and thank donors. The largest donation had come from Leonard Pierce. Accordingly, Pierce was invited to make a short speech. Villagers gathered around the platform. The brass band fell silent. Children stopped running. The vicar stepped forward. "My friends, thank you all for supporting this important project." Polite applause followed. The speech continued. Then Pierce approached the platform. He removed his hat. He smiled broadly. For perhaps 20 seconds, everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Then Clara Hawthorne pushed through the crowd. Several people turned. Her face had gone pale. Not frightened, determined. She moved rapidly toward the platform. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. Clara reached the front row. "Mr. Pierce," the words emerged sharply. Pierce looked down. Several villagers exchanged surprised glances. Clara rarely interrupted public events. Pierce's smile vanished. "What is it?" he asked. There was no answer. For a brief instant, Clara stared directly at him. The expression in her eyes startled those nearest. It was not anger, it was a certainty, absolute certainty. Then a terrible sound shattered the afternoon. A crack, a splintering crash. Screams erupted. The wooden platform beneath Pierce gave way. Part of the supporting structure collapsed. The enormous replacement church bell toppled sideways. Hundreds watched in horror. The bell struck Leonard Pierce and pinned him beneath its immense weight. Chaos followed. Women cried out. Children began sobbing. Several men rushed forward. The vicar stumbled backward in shock. Sergeant Reed pushed through the crowd. "Move back! Everyone move back!" The bell required 6 men to lift sufficiently. By then it was already clear. Leonard Pierce was dead. The village fete ended at once. People drifted away in stunned silence. Small groups formed along lanes and cottage gates. The same questions repeated endlessly. How had the platform collapsed? Was it an accident? Has the structure been faulty? Why had Clara Hawthorne approached Pierce at that precise moment? And why had Pierce looked frightened when he saw her? As evening approached, Sergeant Reed examined the wreckage. Several carpenters assisted him. The platform appeared sturdy enough. Most of the supports remained intact. Only one critical beam had failed. Reed frowned. The broken timber did not resemble ordinary damage. Someone had cut deeply into it beforehand. Not enough to attract attention, enough to weaken it. A dangerous realization settled upon him. This had not been an accident. The beam had been sabotaged. Leonard Pierce had been murdered. News spread through St. Alderwick before sunset. Doors opened. Curtains twitched. Telephone calls multiplied. Speculation flourished. Some blamed a business rival. Others mentioned unpaid debts. Several recalled arguments. Everyone suddenly remembered something suspicious. Miss Marple sat quietly in Mrs. Fairchild's sitting room drinking tea. The older woman remained deeply unsettled. "Murder," she whispered. "It seems likely. But who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "That is not always the correct question." Mrs. Fairchild blinked. "What do you mean?" "The more useful question is often why." Outside, evening shadows lengthened across the village. At Hawthorne's bakery, Clara sat alone after closing. The ovens had cooled. The counters were empty. Her husband had gone upstairs. She remained in the darkened shop, staring through the window. Her hands trembled, not because Leonard Pierce was dead, not because the police would investigate, not even because villagers would gossip. She trembled because of something else, something she had discovered 3 weeks earlier, something she had intended to reveal, something connected to Leonard Pierce, and something that, she now realized, might place her in terrible danger. Across the street, unseen by Clara, a solitary figure watched the bakery window. The figure remained motionless for several moments, then quietly disappeared into the darkness. The murder of Leonard Pierce had only begun to expose the secrets hidden within St. Alderwick, and before the truth emerged, another crime would shake the village even more profoundly. Nothing alters the rhythm of a small community quite so quickly as sudden death. Shops still open, milk was still delivered, church bells still rang, yet every ordinary activity seemed accompanied by whispered conversations and cautious glances. The murder of Leonard Pierce had become the sole subject of discussion. At Mrs. Brindle's tea room, Customers leaned together over cups of tea. At the butcher's shop, transactions paused while theories were exchanged. At church, parishioners offered solemn expressions while secretly observing who appeared nervous. Miss Marple attended the morning service beside Mrs. Fairchild. The congregation seemed unusually attentive during prayers, though not necessarily for spiritual reasons. People watched one another. Human curiosity, Miss Marple reflected, was among the most reliable forces in nature. He treated people dreadfully. It could have been anybody, or perhaps somebody wanted revenge. That bakery woman certainly looked upset. Several heads nodded. The remark spread quickly. By lunchtime, many villagers had become convinced that Clara Hawthorne knew more than she admitted. By evening, some had practically convicted her. Miss Marple listened without comment. She knew how swiftly suspicion could gather momentum. A rumour, once released, often travelled faster than truth. Meanwhile, Sergeant Malcolm Reed spent the morning examining the damaged platform. 2 carpenters joined him. The weakened support beam lay on a workbench inside the church hall. Reed studied it carefully. The cut had been made deliberately, not by accident, not by weather damage. A saw had removed nearly 3/4 of the wood from the interior side of the beam. From the outside, however, the damage remained almost invisible. Anyone conducting a casual inspection would have seen nothing unusual. "Could it have broken naturally?" asked one carpenter. "No." The answer came immediately. The carpenter nodded grimly. "Then somebody planned this." "Yes." The realization weighed heavily upon Reed. This was not a crime committed in sudden anger. It required preparation, patience, forethought. Someone had intended Leonard Pierce to stand precisely where he stood. Someone had waited for the right moment. Someone had known the bell would finish the job. The murderer possessed a cold and calculating mind. At Hawthorne's bakery, business continued despite the circumstances. Customers arrived throughout the morning. Most purchased bread. Many arrived hoping for information. Clara recognized the difference. The questions began almost immediately. "Terrible business yesterday." "Awful. You seemed upset before it happened." "Did I?" "You spoke to Mr. Pierce." "Only briefly." "What did you say?" "Nothing important." The answers remained calm, polite, brief. Yet customers left dissatisfied. Clara was concealing something. That much seemed obvious. The problem was determining what. By midday, even Walter Hawthorne had begun asking questions. The bakery kitchen smelled of yeast and warm bread. Walter removed a tray from the oven and placed it on a cooling rack. His forehead glistened with perspiration. "Clara." She looked up. "What is it?" "You should tell me what's troubling you." "I'm perfectly well." "No, you aren't." She remained silent. Walter wiped flour from his hands. "You argued with Pierce." "It wasn't an argument." "Then what was it?" Still she hesitated. Walter rarely pressed matters. His wife usually volunteered information when ready. Today felt different. The silence stretched. Finally Clara spoke. "Do you trust me?" The question surprised him. "Of course." "Then please leave it alone." Walter studied her carefully. He saw fear. Don't panic. Not guilt. Fear. That realization troubled him far more than any rumor. Late that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the bakery. The bell above the door chimed softly. Clara smiled upon seeing her. Miss Marple had an unusual gift. People often found themselves speaking more freely than intended. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. I thought I might purchase one of your fruit loaves." "Certainly." As Clara wrapped the loaf, Miss Marple examined the shelves. Everything appeared orderly, comforting, normal, the sort of place people trusted. The elderly lady eventually said, "You seem tired." Clara paused. "Do I?" "Perhaps only a little." A faint smile appeared. "Yesterday was difficult." "Yes." The answer contained more meaning than the single word suggested. Miss Marple waited. She had learned long ago that silence often invited honesty. Sure enough, Clara spoke again. I keep wondering whether things might have been different. Different in what way? I almost spoke to him earlier. Mr. Pierce? Yes. Miss Marple nodded. The younger woman lowered her voice. I wanted answers. About something specific. Clara hesitated, then shook her head. I shouldn't have even said that. Miss Marple accepted the retreat without objection. People reveal secrets gradually. Forcing them rarely helps. As she turned to leave, something caught her attention. A small framed photograph sat upon a shelf behind the counter. The image showed a village picnic from several years earlier. Dozens of smiling faces appeared. Among them stood Leonard Pierce. Next to him stood a younger man Miss Marple did not recognize. The man seemed oddly familiar nonetheless, not because of his face, because of something else. A posture, an expression, a habit. Miss Marple lingered for a moment, then left without mentioning it. The observation settled quietly into her mind. That evening, Sergeant Reed visited Leonard Pierce's house. The property stood on the edge of the village behind wrought iron gates. It was larger than most homes in St. Alderwick, not grand enough to be called an estate, large enough to remind visitors of its owner's success. Pierce's housekeeper admitted him. The drawing room contained several guests. Among them sat Harold Vance, Pierce's business partner. Vance appeared exhausted. He was a thin man with sharp features and perpetually worried eyes. Terrible loss, Reed said. Yes. Vance's voice sounded strained. We worked together for nearly 15 years. Reed asked routine questions. Had Pierce received threats? Had he argued with anyone recently? Did he fear for his safety? Most answers proved unhelpful. Then one detail emerged. About a month ago, said Vance, he became concerned about something. What sort of thing? He never told me directly. Concerned how? He started locking documents away. Reed frowned. What documents? I don't know. You never asked. I did. Vance managed a humorless smile. Leonard wasn't particularly fond of sharing information. The remark felt truthful. Reed made a note. A man protecting documents suggested secrets, and secrets often suggested motives. That night, rain arrived. Gentle showers tapped against windows throughout the village. Most residents slept poorly. The murder occupied their thoughts. Clara Hawthorne slept least of all. Near midnight, she descended quietly into the bakery. Moonlight filtered through the front window. She unlocked a drawer beneath the counter. From inside, she removed a folded envelope. Its contents had already been examined dozens of times. Yet she looked again. Several papers, a photograph, a handwritten letter. The same items that had troubled her for weeks. Items connected directly to Leonard Pierce. Her expression hardened. "What were you hiding?" she whispered. A floorboard creaked. Clara froze. Someone was outside. Not in the bakery. Outside the rear door. She heard movement. Slow. Careful. Intentional. Her pulse quickened. The footsteps stopped. For several seconds there was silence. Then another sound. The faint rattle of the door handle. Once. Twice. Testing. Clara's breath caught. The envelope slipped slightly in her trembling hands. Whoever stood outside remained there only briefly. After a minute, the footsteps retreated. Then silence returned. Clara remained motionless for nearly 5 minutes. When she finally approached the back window, nobody remained. Only darkness and rain. The following morning brought a new development. One that shifted attention sharply. At 10 o'clock, Sergeant Reed received the preliminary findings from investigators examining the platform. The timing of the sabotage had been narrowed. The beam had likely been cut within the previous 3 weeks. No earlier, no later. The information seemed significant. Then another fact emerged. During those same 3 weeks, several villagers had observed Clara Hawthorne visiting the church hall repeatedly. She had volunteered for fete preparations. She had access to the grounds. She had opportunities. By midday, suspicion intensified dramatically. And for the first time, Sergeant Reed found himself wondering whether the village gossip might contain a fragment of truth. Only Miss Marple remained entirely unconvinced. Because while everyone else focused upon Clara Hawthorne's behaviour, Miss Marple continued thinking about something very small. A photograph, a forgotten face, and a curious detail that did not belong. A detail so minor that nobody else had noticed it at all. Chapter 3. The photograph on the bakery shelf. Rain lingered over St. Alderwick throughout Monday morning. The village appeared subdued beneath low grey clouds. Water glistened on rooftops and collected in shallow puddles along the lanes. Even the most enthusiastic gossipers seemed slightly restrained by the weather. Miss Marple, however, found rainy mornings particularly useful. People tended to stay indoors, and indoors people talked. She sat in Mrs. Fairchild's drawing room, with a notebook resting quietly beside her teacup. The notebook contained very little writing. Miss Marple preferred storing observations in her memory. Nevertheless, a few names had been recorded: Leonard Pierce, Clara Hawthorne, Harold Vance, and one other, a man whose name she did not yet know, the man in the photograph. The image remained fixed in her thoughts, not because he appeared suspicious, because something about him felt connected to the entire affair. Experience had taught Miss Marple to trust such impressions, not blindly, but respectfully. Human nature often revealed itself through details others dismissed. Shortly before 11 o'clock, she returned to Hawthorne's bakery. The bell above the door chimed. Clara looked up from arranging loaves. "You've chosen another wet day for a walk." Miss Marple smiled. "My walks are rarely governed by the weather." Clara laughed faintly. The sound seemed genuine, yet shadows lingered beneath her eyes. She had clearly slept little. Miss Marple purchased a small seed cake. Then, as though noticing it for the first time, she glanced toward the framed photograph. What a delightful picture! Clara followed her gaze. Oh, that old thing. When was it taken? 5 years ago. A village picnic? Yes. Miss Marple approached. Such a large gathering. It was one of the best summers we ever had. The older woman studied the faces, then pointed gently. "And who is that gentleman beside Mr. Pierce?" Something changed immediately. Only slightly. A hesitation, barely visible, yet it was there. His name was Michael Trent. The answer came carefully. Was. He died. Miss Marple remained silent. Clara continued. 3 years ago. How sad. Yes. Another pause followed. People don't speak about him much now. The remark seemed odd. Villages rarely stopped speaking about anything entirely. Miss Marple noted it. Was he from St. Alderwick? No. He came here for work. What sort of work? He worked for Pierce. That answer proved far more interesting. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Thank you. Clara appeared relieved when the subject ended, which, naturally, made Miss Marple even more interested. That afternoon she visited the village library. The librarian, Mrs. Ethel Parsons, possessed a remarkable memory and an even greater enthusiasm for local history. Within minutes, several old newspapers had been produced. Miss Marple sat near a window and began reading. Village fetes, church repairs, school events, wedding announcements. Then she found a photograph. A younger Michael Trent appeared alongside Leonard Pierce during the opening of a transport warehouse. The accompanying article described Trent as a promising employee, reliable, popular, hard-working. Miss Marple continued searching. Another article appeared several months later. This one concerned a motor accident. Michael Trent had died when his car left a country road during heavy fog. The accident had been ruled unfortunate but straightforward. No investigation followed. Miss Marple read the article twice, then 3 times. Something bothered her. Not the accident itself, the language. The report described Trent as cheerful and optimistic. Several witnesses had emphasized his plans for the future: new employment opportunities, possible marriage, business ambitions. Yet the article also mentioned substantial financial difficulties shortly before his death. The combination felt curious, not impossible, merely curious. Meanwhile, Sergeant Reed continued questioning villagers. The investigation consumed nearly every waking hour. By afternoon, he sat opposite Harold Vance in Pierce's office. Ledgers covered the desk. Business records filled nearby shelves. The office smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper. "You mentioned documents," Reed said. Vance nodded. "Yes." "Did Pierce ever explain why he became concerned?" "No." "Did anything unusual happen during that period?" Vance hesitated, then sighed. "There was a visitor." "A visitor?" "About 3 weeks ago." Reed leaned forward. "Who?" "I don't know." The answer sounded frustratingly genuine. "A man arrived unexpectedly." "What happened?" "They argued." "About what?" "I couldn't hear everything." Vance rubbed his forehead. "I only heard raised voices." "What sort of argument?" "Pierce was angry. Very angry. Furious." That attracted Reed's attention immediately. Leonard Pierce possessed a reputation for confidence. People like that rarely displayed fury unless something threatened them. "What happened afterward?" "The visitor left." "And Pierce?" "He remained locked in his office for nearly 2 hours." "Did you ever discover the visitor's identity?" "No." Reed made another note. The unknown visitor suddenly seemed important. Very important. Across the village, Clara Hawthorne spent the afternoon struggling to concentrate. Customers entered. Orders were filled. Bread was sold. Yet her thoughts remained elsewhere. The envelope hidden beneath the counter felt heavier with every passing day. She knew she should take it to the police. She had known that for weeks. Yet something prevented her. Fear. Not fear of guilt, fear of consequences. The contents implicated people, powerful people, respected people, people whom the village trusted. She glanced toward the window. A familiar unease returned, the sensation of being watched. Since Leonard Pierce's death, it had grown steadily stronger. Perhaps it was imagination, perhaps not. The uncertainty troubled her. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Harold Vance arrived shortly after 7. Mrs. Fairchild ushered him into the sitting room. The businessman appeared uncomfortable. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." Miss Marple invited him to sit. After several moments of polite conversation, Vance came directly to the point. "You've been asking questions." "A few." "About Michael Trent." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "Have I?" Vance gave a weak smile. "Villages are efficient communication systems. That they are." Silence followed. Then Vance spoke quietly. "Michael was a decent man. You knew him well." "Reasonably well." "And?" The businessman stared into the fireplace. "He deserved better." The words emerged unexpectedly. Emotion coloured them. Miss Marple noticed immediately. "Better than what?" Vance looked up. For several seconds he appeared tempted to say more, then caution returned. "Forget I said anything." "Mr. Vance." "No." He stood abruptly. "I've already said too much." The conversation ended there. Yet after he departed, Miss Marple remained thoughtful. Because people rarely spoke emotionally about matters they considered unimportant. Something connected Michael Trent, Leonard Pierce, and Harold Vance. The question was what? The answer began to emerge the following day. Quite by accident, or what most people would call an accident. Miss Marple preferred another term. Observation. She happened to be sitting near the window of Mrs. Brindle's tea room when 2 elderly villagers entered. Neither noticed her. Their conversation drifted across the room. "Remember Michael Trent?" "Oh, yes. Terrible business." His poor fiancée. Miss Marple's attention sharpened immediately. Fiancée. That detail had not appeared in the newspaper reports. The women continued. Such a lovely girl. I heard she moved away afterward. Can you blame her? No. Especially after what happened. The second woman lowered her voice. Miss Marple could hear only fragments. Didn't believe the accident. Always said something was wrong. Nobody listened. The conversation shifted elsewhere, but the damage was done. A new piece had entered the puzzle. Michael Trent had been engaged, and his fiancée apparently doubted the official explanation of his death. Miss Marple finished her tea and rose immediately. That same afternoon, another event occurred. One far more alarming thing. Clara Hawthorne returned home after closing the bakery. Walter was upstairs. The house seemed quiet. Too quiet. She entered the sitting room, stopped, and stared. Someone had been inside. Drawers stood open. Cabinets had been searched. Papers littered the floor. The room had been thoroughly ransacked. A cold realization struck her. The intruder had not been looking for money, or jewelry, or valuables. The intruder had been searching for something specific, something hidden, something dangerous. Clara rushed downstairs toward the bakery. Her pulse hammered. She unlocked the drawer beneath the counter. The envelope remained there, untouched. For a moment she simply stood, breathing hard. Relief washed through her. Then another thought followed. The intruder would return, sooner or later, because whoever had searched her house clearly believed she possessed something worth finding, something connected to Leonard Pierce, something connected to murder, and perhaps something connected to a death 3 years earlier. As darkness settled over St. Alderwick, Miss Marple sat quietly by the window. Rain clouds had finally cleared. The village looked peaceful once more. Yet beneath that peaceful appearance, hidden currents moved steadily toward danger. A murdered businessman, a dead employee whose accident no longer seemed quite accidental, a frightened baker's wife hiding documents, and somewhere among the familiar faces of St. Alderwick, a killer watching events unfold with growing concern. For the first time, Miss Marple felt certain of one thing. Leonard Pierce's murder had not begun 3 days ago. It had begun 3 years earlier. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Never Believed. The weather improved considerably on Wednesday. Sunlight returned to St. Alderwick, illuminating gardens still wet from recent rain. Roses climbed cottage walls. Bees drifted lazily among flower beds. From a distance, the village appeared untouched by tragedy. Appearances, Miss Marple often reflected, were among the most deceptive things in the world. After breakfast, she set out with a purpose. The conversation overheard in Mrs. Brindle's tea room had provided something invaluable. A name was still missing, but the existence of Michael Trent's fiancée opened an entirely new path of inquiry. Miss Marple intended to follow it. The village librarian proved helpful once again. Mrs. Parsons remembered Michael Trent quite clearly. He was a handsome young fellow. Indeed? Oh yes. The girls were forever finding reasons to visit the transport depot. Miss Marple smiled. And his fiancée? Mrs. Parsons nodded immediately. Sarah Wren. At last, a name. What became of her? I believe she moved to Market Ashbury after Michael died. Do you happen to know where? Mrs. Parsons considered, then disappeared among filing cabinets. Several minutes later she returned with a satisfied expression. I knew I'd seen it somewhere. She handed over a scrap of paper containing an address. Miss Marple thanked her warmly. By midday she was aboard a bus bound for Market Ashbury. Sarah Wren lived in a modest brick cottage on the edge of town. The garden was neat. The curtains were clean. Everything suggested a woman who valued order, a woman who had rebuilt her life carefully after disappointment. The door opened after the second knock. Sarah appeared to be in her early 30s. She possessed intelligent eyes and a reserved manner. When Miss Marple introduced herself and mentioned Michael Trent, Surprise flashed across her face. Then caution. "What is this about? May I come in?" After a brief hesitation, Sarah stepped aside. The sitting room contained books, framed photographs, and a sewing basket beside an armchair. Comfortable, practical, lived in. Miss Marple approved. Tea appeared shortly afterward. Only then did Sarah speak again. "I haven't heard Michael's name in years. Yet you remember him." The younger woman's expression softened. "Every day." Silence lingered. Then Miss Marple explained Leonard Pierce's murder. Sarah listened carefully. When the story ended, she remained very still. "Then someone finally killed him." The words emerged without hesitation. Without regret. Miss Marple studied her. "You mean Mr. Pierce?" "Yes. That is a strong reaction." Sarah gave a bitter laugh. "You didn't know him?" "No, I did." The bitterness deepened. For the first time, genuine emotion broke through her calm exterior. "He destroyed Michael." Miss Marple waited. Sarah eventually continued. "Michael trusted him." "In what way?" "He worked harder than anyone." She stared toward the window. "Leonard Pierce promised opportunities, promotions, partnership one day. And none of it happened." The answer came sharply. "Instead, Michael became frightened." "Frightened of what?" Sarah hesitated, then stood. A small wooden box rested atop a bookshelf. She carried it carefully to the table. Inside were letters, dozens of them, neatly tied together. Michael wrote these during his final months. Miss Marple opened one. The handwriting was steady, the tone affectionate. Then, gradually, concern emerged. References to arguments, references to documents, references to something being hidden. One sentence particularly attracted Miss Marple's attention. "Pierce says I ask too many questions." Another, "If anything happens, there are people who should know the truth." Miss Marple reread that line, slowly, carefully. "What truth?" she asked. Sarah shook her head. "He never explained." "Did you ask?" "Repeatedly. And he always said he needed proof." That answer seemed important. Very important. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. "What happened shortly before his death?" Sarah's face hardened. "He came to see me 2 days beforehand." "Was he upset?" "Terrified." The word hung heavily between them. "He told me something was about to change." "How?" "He wouldn't say." Sarah looked down at her hands. "He promised everything would be settled soon." "Did he mention Pierce?" "Several times." "And then?" A long pause followed. "When Michael died, I knew immediately something was wrong." "Why?" Sarah met her eyes. "Because fear had vanished." Miss Marple blinked. "What do you mean?" "He'd been frightened for months." Sarah spoke slowly, thoughtfully. "Then suddenly he became hopeful." The observation resonated deeply with Miss Marple. Human behavior, always human behavior. People contemplating despair behaved one way. People expecting success behaved another. The distinction mattered greatly. "If Michael expected good news," Miss Marple said quietly, "an accidental death becomes harder to accept." Sarah nodded. "I never believed it." Back in St. Alderwick, Sergeant Reed encountered a similar puzzle. The murdered man's records continued yielding surprises. Another locked drawer had been discovered inside Pierce's office. Its contents included correspondence, financial statements, and property documents. Nothing obviously criminal. Yet Reed noticed irregularities. Several transactions lacked proper explanations. Large sums had moved between accounts. Some names appeared repeatedly. Others had vanished entirely. The pattern felt wrong, though he could not yet explain why. Harold Vance looked increasingly uncomfortable as questions continued. Reed noticed. He filed the observation away. That evening brought another unexpected development. Walter Hawthorne arrived at Mrs. Fairchild's cottage. He appeared exhausted, worried, and angry. Not at Miss Marple, at circumstances. My wife won't tell me what's happening. Miss Marple invited him inside. Walter remained standing. Something frightened her before Pierce died. Yes, I know that much. He rubbed a hand across his face. Then yesterday somebody searched our house. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. You've informed the police? Of course. And? They found nothing. Walter laughed humorlessly. They also don't know what was being searched for. Miss Marple understood the frustration. The baker looked genuinely distressed. Not suspicious, not deceptive, simply concerned. Mr. Hawthorne, she asked gently, has your wife ever kept secrets from you before? The answer came immediately. No. That was interesting. People often lied to protect themselves. They rarely hid dangerous information from those they trusted, unless they feared consequences extending beyond themselves. Miss Marple suspected Clara belonged to that category. Later that night, Clara sat alone in the bakery once more. The envelope rested before her. For several minutes she simply stared at it. Then she made a decision. A difficult one, but necessary. Tomorrow she would finally tell someone. The burden had become too great, the danger too obvious. She reached for the envelope. A sudden sound interrupted her. The front doorbell. Soft, almost delicate, yet impossible at this hour. Clara froze. The bakery was closed. No customer should be there. The bell sounded again. Once. Twice. Someone stood outside, waiting. Her pulse quickened. Slowly she approached the front window. The street beyond appeared empty. No figure stood beneath the lamps. No visitor waited by the door. Then she noticed something. An envelope lying on the doorstep. White, plain, unmarked. After several moments she unlocked the door and retrieved it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Only 4 handwritten words appeared. You know too much. Nothing else. No signature. No explanation. No mistake regarding its meaning. The message was unmistakably a threat. Clara's hands trembled. For several minutes she simply stared at the paper. Then, for the first time since Leonard Pierce died, genuine panic took hold. Someone knew she possessed information. Someone believed she might reveal it. And someone was willing to frighten her into silence. At nearly the same moment, Miss Marple sat awake in her bedroom. Sleep had proven elusive. Her thoughts remained occupied by Sarah Wren's account. A particular detail repeated itself endlessly. Michael Trent had been frightened, then hopeful, then dead. The sequence mattered, very much, because it suggested a pattern. A man discovers something. He gathers evidence. He prepares to act. Then he dies before he can reveal the truth. 3 years later, Leonard Pierce becomes fearful. Clara Hawthorne discovers hidden documents. Then Leonard Pierce is murdered. The parallels felt too strong to ignore. Miss Marple gazed out the window toward the sleeping village. A realization was beginning to form. Not a solution. Not yet. But the outline of one. Someone had been protecting a secret for years. A secret powerful enough to destroy lives. A secret worth killing for. And somewhere within Clara Hawthorne's mysterious envelope lay the key to understanding it. The difficulty, Miss Marple suspected, would be keeping Clara alive long enough to reveal what she knew. Chapter 5. The Envelope Beneath the Counter. Thursday dawned bright and clear. For most villagers, the return of sunshine brought relief. Gardens needed tending. Deliveries resumed. Children reclaimed the village green. Yet beneath the ordinary routines of St. Alderwick, unease persisted. The murder remained unsolved. And now, although only a handful of people knew it, a second danger was quietly unfolding. Clara Hawthorne carried a secret that someone desperately wanted buried. She arrived at Mrs. Fairchild's cottage shortly after 9 o'clock. The threatening note remained folded inside her handbag. Miss Marple had just finished breakfast when Edith Fairchild showed the visitor inside. One look at Clara's face was enough. Something had changed. "You've had a difficult night," Miss Marple observed. Clara nodded. Without speaking, she removed the note and placed it on the table. Miss Marple read it. Her expression altered very little, yet her eyes sharpened. "When did this arrive?" "Last night." "You told nobody?" "Only now." "Not even your husband?" "No." Miss Marple folded the paper carefully. "I think that may have been unwise." "I know." Clara looked exhausted. "I didn't know what else to do." Silence lingered. Then Miss Marple asked the question she had been waiting to ask for days. "What is in the envelope?" Clara stared at her hands. For several moments she said nothing. The struggle was visible. Fear battled caution. Caution battled conscience. At last she spoke. "I found it by accident." "Where? In the bakery?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "The bakery? 3 weeks ago." Clara took a deep breath. The floorboards behind the old storage shelves had become loose. She paused. Walter was repairing them. "And?" "He found a hidden compartment." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "What was inside?" "A metal tin. Nothing unusual so far." "No," Clara swallowed, "until we opened it." The envelope now rested upon the table between them. Clara carefully removed its contents. Several folded papers, a faded photograph, 2 handwritten letters, and a small notebook. Miss Marple examined them one by one. The photograph came first. It showed Leonard Pierce standing beside 3 men. One of them was Harold Vance. Another was Michael Trent. The 4th man was unfamiliar, a heavy-set individual with a narrow face and unsettling eyes. The image had been taken years earlier, perhaps 6 or 7. "What is significant about this?" Miss Marple asked. "Turn it over." She did. Written in faded ink were several words. "Warehouse purchase, February 1951. Beneath the writing appeared 4 signatures: Leonard Pierce, Harold Vance, Michael Trent, and the unknown man. Interesting. Very interesting. Next came the notebook. The handwriting belonged to Michael Trent. Miss Marple recognized it immediately from the letters Sarah Wren had shown her. The entries were brief. Dates, names, financial figures. Several pages contained observations, others contained accusations. One entry captured Miss Marple's attention instantly. March 4th, 1955. The records don't match. Someone has been creating false invoices for years. Another. March 11th. Pierce knows. Vance knows. Not sure about the others. And another. March 18th. If I disappear, the truth is in the warehouse accounts. Miss Marple closed the notebook slowly. The room had grown very quiet. What happened after Walter found this? Nothing. Nothing? We hid it. Miss Marple looked surprised. Clara nodded miserably. "I know how foolish it sounds. Why didn't you go to the police?" "Because I was frightened." "Of whom?" Clara hesitated. At first, Leonard Pierce. That answer made perfect sense. The notebook suggested fraud, possibly extensive fraud, possibly involving multiple people, the sort of secret that could ruin reputations and destroy businesses. The final document proved the most revealing. It was a letter, unsigned, undated, apparently never sent. The handwriting belonged to Michael Trent. Miss Marple read carefully. "If anything should happen to me, Leonard Pierce cannot claim ignorance. He knows exactly where the missing money went. The others are equally involved. I have copied records proving it. They believe I will remain silent. They are mistaken." Miss Marple reread the passage, then folded the letter. At last the shape of the mystery was beginning to emerge. Not fully, but enough to glimpse its outline. Michael Trent had discovered wrongdoing, serious wrongdoing. Soon afterward he died. 3 years later, Leonard Pierce became fearful. Then Leonard Pierce was murdered. The connection seemed undeniable. "Who else knows about these papers?" Miss Marple asked. "Only Walter. Nobody else?" "No." "You're certain?" "Yes." Miss Marple considered. Someone had searched Clara's home. Someone had delivered a threat, yet Clara claimed the secret remained known only to herself and her husband. That contradiction demanded explanation. Either someone had discovered the existence of the papers independently, or someone else already knew exactly what Michael Trent had uncovered. By midday, Sergeant Reed received new information of his own. The financial records recovered from Pierce's office had been reviewed by an accountant from county headquarters. The findings were troubling. Several transactions appeared entirely fictitious. Money had vanished, large sums, repeatedly, over many years, yet the losses had been concealed through elaborate bookkeeping. Reed stared at the report. What does this mean? The accountant tapped several pages. It means somebody was stealing. Pierce? Possibly. Alone? The accountant shook his head. Almost certainly not. Reed leaned back. At last, a motive began taking shape. Fraud, blackmail, exposure, revenge. The possibilities multiplied rapidly. That afternoon he questioned Harold Vance again. The businessman appeared even more strained than before. Dark circles had formed beneath his eyes. His collar seemed suddenly too tight. Reed placed the accounting report on the desk. Vance stared at it. His face drained of colour. "Where did you get this?" "County headquarters." Vance remained silent. "Do you recognize the figures?" No answer. "Mr. Vance?" Finally the businessman spoke. "Leonard handled most of the accounts." "That's not what I asked." Silence again. Reed watched him carefully. People rarely revealed themselves through words. Pressure often produced more useful results. Did Michael Trent discover these discrepancies? Vance's reaction lasted less than a second. Yet it was enough. A flicker. Shock. Fear. Recognition. Then it vanished. Too late. Reed had seen it. And so had Vance. The businessman lowered his head. "You're asking dangerous questions." The statement hung heavily in the room. Reed's attention sharpened. Dangerous for whom? But Vance would say nothing more. That evening Miss Marple sat quietly in the Fairchild garden. The setting sun painted the village in warm gold. Birdsong drifted through the air. Everything seemed peaceful, yet her thoughts remained fixed upon one question. Why kill Leonard Pierce now? The fraud explained Michael Trent. It explained fear. It explained blackmail. Perhaps even motive. But it did not explain timing. If someone wished to silence Pierce, why wait 3 years? Why murder him during the summer fete? Why choose such a public method? There was something missing, a crucial piece still hidden. Miss Marple knew it instinctively, and instincts, when properly examined, often proved remarkably reliable. The missing piece arrived unexpectedly that night, shortly before 10 o'clock. A loud knock sounded at Mrs. Fairchild's front door. Edith answered it. Moments later, she hurried into the sitting room. "Jane, what is it?" "It's Sergeant Reed." The policeman entered immediately. His expression was grim, not merely concerned, alarmed. "There's been another incident." Miss Marple rose. "What happened?" "Harold Vance." A pause followed. The answer came quietly. "We found him unconscious inside the transport office." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Dead?" "Not yet." The distinction carried little comfort. "What happened?" Reed hesitated. "We're not entirely certain." "Tell me." "He appears to have fallen down the warehouse stairs." Miss Marple said nothing. The explanation sounded plausible. Too plausible. The sergeant evidently shared her doubts. "An accident?" she asked. Reed shook his head slowly. "I don't think so." A heavy silence settled over the room. Someone had already murdered Leonard Pierce. Now Harold Vance had been attacked. Or perhaps silenced. Either way, the implications were unmistakable. The killer was growing desperate. And desperate people often made mistakes. Miss Marple gazed toward the darkened window. Beyond it, somewhere in the sleeping village, a murderer had taken action once again. Not to commit a new crime, but to prevent an old secret from emerging. And if Harold Vance survived the night, he might possess answers capable of changing everything. Chapter 6. The Man at the Bottom of the Stairs. The news of Harold Vance's fall spread through St. Alderwick before breakfast. By 8 o'clock, villagers had already reached several conclusions. Some believed he had been attacked, others insisted he had simply slipped. A few suggested that guilt had finally overwhelmed him. Theories flourished as freely as weeds. Facts remained considerably scarcer. Miss Marple spent little time discussing rumours. She preferred information, and information, she suspected, was currently lying in a hospital bed at the county infirmary. Sergeant Reed arrived there shortly after 9. Harold Vance had survived. Barely. A fractured arm, several bruised ribs, and a severe concussion had left him pale and weak. Nevertheless, he was conscious. A nurse permitted Reed only a brief interview. The sergeant pulled a chair beside the bed. "Can you tell me what happened?" Vance stared at the ceiling. His face looked years older than it had a week earlier. "I don't remember everything." "What do you remember?" "A noise." "What sort of noise?" "I was working late." Vance spoke slowly, carefully. "There was somebody in the warehouse. Did you see them?" "No." "You heard them?" "Yes." "What happened next?" The businessman closed his eyes. "I went downstairs." "And?" "Someone was waiting." Reed leaned forward. "Who?" Vance opened his eyes. For a moment, genuine fear appeared. Not uncertainty, fear. Then he shook his head. "I never saw their face." The answer disappointed Reed, yet it sounded truthful. "What happened then?" "I remember being pushed." A silence followed. "Not an accident, then?" "Not at all." "Mr. Vance," Reed said quietly, "why would someone want to harm you?" The businessman gave a bitter laugh. "You already know. Tell me anyway." Vance turned toward the window. "The accounts. Michael Trent discovered something." No answer. "Didn't he?" The businessman finally nodded. A single, reluctant nod. And with that gesture, years of secrecy began to unravel. Meanwhile, Miss Marple pursued a different line of inquiry. The mysterious fourth man in the photograph continued to trouble her. His face seemed oddly familiar, not personally familiar, historically familiar, like a name half remembered from an old conversation. Late that morning she returned to the library. Mrs. Parsons greeted her warmly. "Researching again?" "Only a little." The librarian smiled knowingly. Within 20 minutes, several local business directories and newspaper archives covered the table. Miss Marple examined them patiently. Years passed through the pages. Then suddenly she found him. The narrow face, the heavy build, the unsettling eyes. The accompanying article identified him as Victor Langley. Miss Marple sat very still. Victor Langley had once owned several storage warehouses across the county. Among them was the warehouse purchased in 1951 by Leonard Pierce and his associates, the very warehouse mentioned on the photograph. More importantly, another article appeared 18 months later, a scandal, minor at the time, forgotten now, yet interesting, very interesting indeed. Langley had abruptly left England. No explanation had ever been provided. Several business disputes remained unresolved. Creditors complained. Records disappeared. Questions lingered. And then Victor Langley simply vanished. Miss Marple reread the article carefully. A small observation caught her attention. One sentence, only one. Yet it altered everything. Mr. Langley's departure followed allegations concerning irregular financial records. Miss Marple leaned back. At last, the first solid bridge between past and present. That afternoon she shared her findings with Sergeant Reed. The two met in the church garden. Summer sunlight filtered through ancient trees. Children played nearby. The ordinary sounds of village life felt strangely disconnected from the conversation. "Victor Langley?" Reed repeated. "Yes. And he disappeared." Apparently, the sergeant frowned. You're suggesting the fraud began before Michael Trent discovered it. Quite possibly. Miss Marple folded her hands. Consider the sequence. Reed listened. Langley owns the warehouse. Yes. He sells it to Pierce and his partners. Correct. Financial irregularities already exist. Perhaps. Then Michael discovers them years later. Miss Marple nodded. Which means he may not have uncovered a new crime. The sergeant's eyes widened. He uncovered an old one. Exactly. The distinction mattered enormously, because old crimes generated different motives than new ones, different fears, different enemies. Later that day, Reed returned to the infirmary. Harold Vance appeared slightly stronger. The sergeant decided it was time for direct questions. Who was Victor Langley? The effect was immediate. Vance stiffened. His expression changed completely. Recognition, alarm, regret. All within a second, Reed saw everything. So you remember him? The businessman sighed heavily. Unfortunately. Tell me. For several moments, Vance remained silent. Then something inside him seemed to break. Perhaps exhaustion, perhaps fear, perhaps the realization that secrecy no longer offered protection. We should never have dealt with him. Why? Because he was dishonest. The answer emerged bitterly. Leonard knew it. Yet worked with him anyway? Yes. Why? Vance laughed humorlessly. Money. The explanation required no elaboration. Did Langley steal from the company? Not exactly. Then what? The businessman looked around the room as though ensuring nobody else could hear. Then he lowered his voice. There was no company. Reed blinked. What? The warehouse accounts. Vance swallowed. The sergeant felt a jolt of realization. False transactions, a nod, among other things. How much money? I don't know. Thousands? Another nod. More. Reed sat back. The scale exceeded expectations, substantially. What happened after Langley disappeared? Leonard took control. The answer came quietly. And Michael found evidence. Yes. The businessman closed his eyes. He found far too much. Back in St. Alderwick, Clara Hawthorne received an unexpected visitor, Sarah Wren, Michael Trent's former fiancée. The meeting had been arranged by Miss Marple. The two women sat together in the bakery after closing. For a while neither spoke. Both understood the significance of the moment. Eventually, Sarah broke the silence. Michael trusted you. Clara looked surprised. He mentioned me several times. The baker's wife smiled faintly. He was kind. He respected you. Sarah hesitated. That's why I'm here. She removed a folded letter from her handbag. I found this after Miss Marple visited. Clara accepted it. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Michael. The letter had never been mailed. Several paragraphs concerned everyday matters. Then one sentence stood out. If anything happens, Clara will know who to trust. Clara stared. A strange feeling washed over her. Sadness, confusion, responsibility. Michael had written those words years ago, yet somehow they felt addressed directly to the present. Why would he write this? Sarah asked. Clara looked up slowly. I don't know, but that wasn't entirely true. A suspicion was forming. One she wasn't yet ready to voice. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone beneath the fading light of sunset. The pieces continued shifting into place. Fraud. Victor Langley. Michael Trent. Leonard Pierce. Harold Vance. Each connection revealed another. Yet one question remained stubbornly unresolved. Who had actually committed the murder? Fraud explained motive. But several people now possessed motives. Perhaps many. The solution required something more precise, something personal, something rooted not merely in money but in character. Miss Marple believed firmly that crimes reflected personality. One could often understand a murderer by understanding what offended them most: greed, humiliation, fear, jealousy, resentment. The motive mattered, but the emotional wound beneath the motive mattered even more. And somewhere among the villagers of St. Alderwick lived a person carrying such a wound. Near midnight, another discovery occurred. A policeman searching Leonard Pierce's office found a concealed compartment behind a filing cabinet. Inside rested several documents. Most appeared financial. One did not. It was a letter, old, folded many times, addressed to Leonard Pierce. The signature at the bottom caused immediate concern, because it belonged to Michael Trent, and the final sentence read, "If I die before exposing this, understand that I will not be the only victim." When Sergeant Reed read the line, he felt a cold certainty settle over him. Michael Trent had expected danger. Years before his death, years before Leonard Pierce's murder, years before Harold Vance's attack, which meant all three events might belong to the same chain. Not separate crimes, not separate motives, a single story, one that had begun years earlier and was only now approaching its conclusion. And somewhere within that story waited the name of a killer who had managed to remain hidden for far too long. Chapter 7. Ghosts of the Warehouse. The warehouse stood at the far edge of St. Alderwick, beyond the railway siding and a line of neglected storage yards. It was an unremarkable building, weathered brick, high windows coated with years of dust, a rusting metal sign bearing the faded name of Pierce Transport. Nothing about it suggested mystery, nothing about it suggested murder. Yet by Friday morning, Miss Marple had become convinced that the warehouse contained the heart of the entire affair. Not merely Leonard Pierce's murder, not merely Harold Vance's attack. Everything, including the death of Michael Trent 3 years earlier. Sergeant Reed accompanied her. The arrangement surprised him slightly. Most amateur investigators preferred theories. Miss Marple preferred places. Places often revealed habits, and habits revealed people. The warehouse manager unlocked the doors. Dust drifted through shafts of sunlight. The interior smelled of timber, oil, and old paper. Rows of shelves stretched across the building. Crates occupied corners. Accounting offices overlooked the loading floor. Everything appeared ordinary. Miss Marple moved slowly, observing, not searching for evidence, searching for understanding. The distinction mattered. "Where were the old records kept?" she asked. The manager pointed upstairs. "In storage." They climbed a narrow staircase. Halfway up, Reed paused. "This is where Vance fell." Miss Marple examined the steps. A person pushed unexpectedly could easily tumble the entire distance. The attack suddenly felt very real, very deliberate. She continued upward. The record room contained dozens of boxes, years of invoices, receipts, shipping manifests, business correspondence, a tedious collection by most standards. To Miss Marple, it resembled a map. One merely needed patience to read it. Several hours passed. Most documents proved unremarkable. Then Reed discovered something curious, a ledger from 1955. The very year Michael Trent died. Several pages had been removed, not torn recently, years earlier, carefully, professionally. The missing pages occupied precisely the period referenced in Michael's notebook, March and April, the months before his death. Reed stared at the gap. Somebody wanted these gone. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, the missing records represented fear. Nothing else removed pages from ledgers. Not greed, not carelessness. Fear. Someone feared what those pages contained. At noon, another visitor arrived unexpectedly. A retired warehouse clerk named Arthur Bellamy. 72 years old, thin, polite, possessed of a memory that astonished everyone who knew him. He had heard investigators were asking questions. and he believed he might help. Reed invited him inside. The old man removed his hat. "I don't know whether this matters. Tell us anyway." Bellamy nodded. "Michael Trent came here the night before he died." Both Reed and Miss Marple exchanged glances. "You're certain?" "Quite certain." The answer came immediately. "I was working late." "What happened?" Bellamy frowned thoughtfully. "He argued with somebody." "Who?" "I couldn't see clearly." "Was it Pierce?" "No." The answer arrived without hesitation. "It wasn't Pierce." That changed everything. "Then who?" Bellamy shook his head. The office blinds were closed. "What did you hear?" The elderly man thought carefully, then repeated the words he remembered. "You've had years to tell the truth." Silence followed. "Years to tell the truth." Miss Marple repeated the phrase softly. Bellamy nodded. Then Michael said something else. "What?" "Tomorrow changes everything." The room became very still. Those words aligned perfectly with Sarah Wren's recollections. Michael had expected something, a revelation, an exposure, a reckoning, and within 24 hours he was dead. After Bellamy departed, Miss Marple walked alone through the warehouse yard. The pieces continued arranging themselves. Yet one detail refused to cooperate: the identity of the person Michael confronted. Not Pierce. Not necessarily Vance. Someone else. Someone with a direct connection to the fraud. Someone Michael believed should have spoken years earlier. The phrase intrigued her. Years to tell the truth. Not years to repay money. Not years to confess. Years to tell the truth. The wording suggested knowledge, complicity, silence, a witness rather than a mastermind. Interesting. Very interesting. That afternoon, another development emerged. Harold Vance requested a private meeting. The sergeant and Miss Marple visited him together. The businessman appeared weaker than before, yet oddly relieved. "Like a man preparing to surrender a burden. I've spent years convincing myself it wasn't my fault." No greeting, no introduction, just the statement. Reed sat down. "What wasn't your fault?" Vance laughed bitterly. "Everything." The room fell silent. Then, slowly, the truth began emerging. Victor Langley had created a network of false transactions. Pierce had joined willingly. Several others assisted. The scheme generated substantial profits. For a time, nobody questioned it. Then Michael Trent noticed discrepancies. "He was too honest," Vance said. The remark contained admiration and regret. "What happened?" Reed asked. "Michael confronted Leonard. And?" "Leonard denied everything. Then?" Vance looked away. "Michael gathered proof." "Enough proof?" "More than enough." Miss Marple leaned forward. "What happened next?" The businessman swallowed. "Michael wasn't killed because of money." The statement surprised everyone. "Explain." Vance closed his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice sounded exhausted. "He was killed because he wouldn't stop." The distinction struck Miss Marple immediately. Money had created the conflict. Persistence had created the danger. Michael refused silence. Someone decided silence was necessary. That evening, Miss Marple received another piece of information. Quite unexpectedly, the source was Mrs. Brindle. The tea-room proprietor arrived carrying a tray of cakes and a remarkable piece of gossip. Normally, Miss Marple treated gossip cautiously. Today proved different. "I remembered something." Miss Marple looked up. "Yes?" "It's about Leonard Pierce." Mrs. Brindle lowered her voice. "He used to visit Rosewood Cottage." "Whose cottage?" "Margaret Ashcombe's." The name meant nothing, yet Mrs. Brindle's expression suggested significance. And nobody knew why. Miss Marple waited. The woman continued. "Margaret rarely socialized." "How unusual." "Very." Mrs. Brindle nodded emphatically. Yet Pierce visited her regularly. How long ago? Years. Recently? No. The tea-room owner hesitated. Not since her death. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. When did she die? 4 years ago. The timing immediately attracted notice. 1 year before Michael Trent's death. Coincidence, perhaps? Perhaps not. What happened to her? Heart trouble. Miss Marple filed the information away. Another name, another connection. Another possible thread. The tapestry continued growing larger. Later that night, while reviewing everything she had learned, Miss Marple experienced a rare moment of certainty. Not certainty regarding the killer, not yet. Certainty regarding the shape of the mystery. For days, everyone had treated the fraud as the central secret. But fraud alone felt insufficient. People stole money. People concealed records. People lied. Such crimes were common. Murder required something stronger, something emotional, something capable of surviving years. Michael Trent's determination, Leonard Pierce's fear, Harold Vance's guilt. None fully explained the violence. There had to be another secret, a more personal one hidden beneath the financial scandal, and somehow Margaret Ashcombe belonged to it. Miss Marple could feel the connection. Not logically, not yet, but instinctively. Human nature again. Always human nature. The next morning brought a discovery that transformed speculation into urgency. Police officers searching old county records located Margaret Ashcombe's will. The document itself appeared ordinary until they reached the list of beneficiaries. There, among family members and charities, appeared a name that shocked Sergeant Reed. Not Leonard Pierce, not Harold Vance, not Michael Trent. The beneficiary was someone nobody had connected to the case. Someone respected, trusted, well-liked throughout St. Alderwick, and someone who had never appeared on the list of suspects. When Reed saw the name, he immediately requested a confidential meeting with Miss Marple, because for the first time since Leonard Pierce died beneath the church bell, a completely new suspect had emerged. A suspect whose connection to Margaret Ashcombe suggested that the true motive for murder might have nothing to do with missing money at all, and everything to do with a secret buried long before Michael Trent ever opened a ledger. Chapter 8. The Name in the Will. Saturday morning arrived with a brightness that felt almost inappropriate. Children played on the village green, gardeners trimmed hedges, bicycles rattled along quiet lanes. To an outsider, St. Alderwick might have appeared perfectly content, yet beneath the village's calm surface, tensions continued tightening, secrets were emerging, and secrets rarely surfaced alone. Sergeant Reed arrived at Mrs. Fairchild's cottage shortly after 10. He carried a brown file beneath his arm. Miss Marple noticed immediately that he seemed unusually thoughtful, not excited, not triumphant, thoughtful. The distinction interested her. "You've found something." "I believe so." The sergeant sat down. For several moments he simply stared at the file. Then he opened it. "This is Margaret Ashcombe's will." Miss Marple nodded. "And the beneficiary?" Reed slid the document across the table. A single name had been underlined. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. Then she read it. Clara Hawthorne. For perhaps 3 seconds neither spoke. The answer surprised both of them. Not because Clara had become wealthy. The amount involved was modest. A cottage, some savings, several pieces of jewellery. The significance lay elsewhere. Why would Margaret Ashcombe leave anything to Clara Hawthorne? The baker's wife had never mentioned the woman, not once. And yet Margaret had remembered her, specifically, deliberately. Miss Marple read the relevant section again, then looked up. When was the will written? 6 months before Margaret died. Interesting, very interesting. An hour later, Clara herself sat in the Fairchild drawing room. The discovery visibly shocked her. Margaret left me something? Apparently. Clara stared at the document. I had no idea. Miss Marple observed her carefully. The surprise appeared genuine, not performed. Not exaggerated, genuine. Tell us about Margaret Ashcombe. The younger woman frowned. There isn't much to tell. Nevertheless, Clara thought for a moment. She lived alone. Yes, I delivered bread to her every morning. And? She was kind. The answer came softly. Lonely, perhaps. Miss Marple waited. Gradually more details emerged. Margaret had possessed few friends, few visitors, few relatives. Yet she and Clara had formed a quiet friendship. Nothing dramatic, simply years of conversation over tea and fresh bread. Did she ever mention Leonard Pierce? The effect was immediate. Clara hesitated, only briefly, but long enough. Sometimes. What did she say? Not much. The hesitation returned. Miss Marple noticed. So did Reed. What did she say, Clara? The baker's wife sighed. She disliked him. An interesting answer. Why? I never asked. That was almost certainly untrue. People always asked. The question was whether Margaret had answered. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Rosewood Cottage. The property had stood empty for years. A local solicitor now maintained it on behalf of distant relatives. With permission obtained, she entered. Dust covered most surfaces. Sunlight filtered through faded curtains. The rooms felt strangely untouched, as though Margaret Ashcombe had merely stepped outside for a short walk. Miss Marple moved slowly, observing, remembering, thinking. The sitting room contained books, photographs, needlework. Nothing remarkable. Then she noticed a writing desk. Locked. The solicitor possessed a key. Several minutes later, the drawers stood open. Most contained ordinary correspondence. One did not. At the back lay a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. Old letters. Very old. Miss Marple examined the dates. The wartime years, and all addressed to Margaret. The sender's name immediately attracted attention. Thomas Pierce. Miss Marple sat very still. Thomas Pierce. Leonard Pierce's father. The letters revealed a romance. A serious one. Perhaps even an engagement. Thomas wrote frequently. Affectionately. Hopefully. Then, suddenly, the tone changed. The final letters contained confusion, pain, betrayal. One passage stood out. You promised me honesty, Margaret. If the child is mine, say so. If not, I deserve the truth. Miss Marple reread the sentence twice. Then a third time. A child. The room seemed quieter suddenly. The implications expanded rapidly. Another letter followed, written months later, far shorter, far colder. Since you have chosen silence, I can only assume my fears were justified. There were no further letters. The correspondence ended there. Abruptly, permanently, Miss Marple folded the papers carefully. A hidden relationship, a disputed child, a silence lasting decades. Now matters became far more interesting and far more dangerous. That evening, she shared the discovery with Sergeant Reed. The sergeant listened carefully. You think Margaret had a child? It appears possible. And Thomas Pierce believed the child might be his. Yes, Reed frowned. But what has this to do with Leonard Pierce? Miss Marple smiled faintly. A very good question. The answer remained uncertain, yet possibilities multiplied. If Margaret had borne a child, if the child's identity had remained hidden, if Leonard Pierce later discovered the truth, then the secret might prove extraordinarily powerful. Family secrets often were, especially when they involved legitimacy, inheritance, identity, and shame. Meanwhile, Harold Vance continued recovering. On Saturday evening, he requested another conversation. This time, he asked specifically for Miss Marple. The request surprised everyone. Nevertheless, arrangements were made. The businessman appeared tired, yet oddly determined, like a man approaching a decision. "I should have spoken years ago." Miss Marple sat quietly beside the bed. "About what?" "Margaret Ashcombe." The answer startled her, not because she expected the name, because she had not expected Vance to know it. "You knew her?" "Yes." "How well?" A pause followed. Then, "Very well." The words carried unusual weight. Miss Marple waited. Eventually he continued. "Michael Trent discovered more than fraud." Her attention sharpened immediately. "What else did he discover?" Vance looked away. For several moments he seemed unable to speak. Then, quietly, "A birth certificate." Silence filled the room. Miss Marple did not interrupt. "A hidden birth certificate," the businessman swallowed. "One that should never have existed." The statement contained fear, old fear, deep fear, the sort that survives years. "Whose birth certificate?" Vance closed his eyes. "I don't know." The answer sounded frustratingly sincere. "Michael never told me." "Then how do you know it existed?" "Because he confronted Leonard with it." Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. At last, at long last, something beyond financial crime, something personal, something capable of inspiring murder. "What happened?" Leonard panicked. The answer came immediately. More frightened than I'd ever seen him. "Why?" "I don't know," Vance laughed bitterly. That became a very common answer in those days. Back in St. Alderwick, Clara Hawthorne sat alone in the bakery after closing. The revelation about Margaret Ashcombe troubled her deeply. Not because of the inheritance, because of memories. Small memories. Forgotten memories. Margaret speaking carefully. Margaret asking strange questions. Margaret watching Leonard Pierce whenever he passed. Details that once seemed meaningless now felt significant. Then another memory surfaced, one she had not considered in years. A conversation shortly before Margaret's death. The elderly woman had appeared unusually emotional. She had taken Clara's hand and said, "One day the truth will come out." "It always does." At the time, Clara assumed illness had prompted the remark. Now she wondered, what truth? And why had Margaret sounded so frightened? Late that night, Miss Marple sat awake by her window. The village slept, yet her thoughts remained active. The fraud, the birth certificate, Margaret Ashcombe, Thomas Pierce, Michael Trent. The connections were finally beginning to converge. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to reveal a pattern. Someone had spent years protecting a secret identity. Michael Trent discovered it. Leonard Pierce feared it. Harold Vance knew fragments of it. Margaret Ashcombe carried it to her grave. And Clara Hawthorne somehow stood closer to the centre of the mystery than anyone yet realized. Miss Marple gazed toward the dark silhouette of the church tower. A realization hovered just beyond reach. The sort of realization that arrives slowly, patiently. Like dawn, she could almost see it. Almost, but not quite. And somewhere in St. Alderwick, another person was beginning to realize the same thing. The murderer. Because if Miss Marple was finally approaching the truth, then the killer would soon face a terrible choice. Confess, run, or kill again. Chapter 9. A Secret Written in Blood. Sunday began with an uneasy stillness. The village had grown accustomed to living beneath a cloud of suspicion. People continued their routines, yet conversations frequently stopped when unfamiliar footsteps approached. Doors closed more quickly. Curtains moved more often. Even the gossip had become cautious. The murderer remained unidentified, and everyone understood that another attack was possible. Miss Marple attended church that morning. Not solely for spiritual reasons. Churches often encouraged reflection, and reflection sometimes produced useful memories. After the service, she lingered among the gravestones behind the church. Names stretched across generations, families intertwined, lives overlapped, villages possessed long memories, longer than most people realized. It occurred to her that secrets rarely vanished entirely, they merely changed form. A hidden relationship became a rumor became a story became a forgotten detail, and years later, some observant person discovered the trail again, much like Michael Trent. That afternoon, Sergeant Reed arrived carrying new information. The expression on his face suggested significance. County records. He placed several documents on the table. I finally located Margaret Ashcombe's medical files. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. Interesting. They confirm she gave birth. Silence followed. Not surprise. Confirmation. The evidence simply transformed possibility into fact. A son? Miss Marple asked. A daughter. The answer immediately narrowed the possibilities. Reed continued. The child was born in late 1941. And the father's name? The sergeant shook his head. Blank. Not unusual for the period, particularly under delicate circumstances. Miss Marple examined the records carefully. Then her attention settled upon another detail. The birth had not occurred in St. Alderwick. It had occurred in a small maternity home nearly 40 miles away. Discretion, privacy, secrecy. The reasons seemed obvious. What happened to the child? She asked. That's where matters become strange. Reed handed over another document. The child appeared to vanish from official records. No adoption paperwork, no death certificate, no school registration, nothing. A girl had been born, then disappeared, as though someone had deliberately erased her. Miss Marple read the documents twice. A troubling thought emerged, not because of what was present, because of what was missing. That evening she requested another meeting with Clara Hawthorne. The baker's wife arrived shortly before 6. Walter accompanied her. Miss Marple approved. The circumstances no longer felt safe. Tea was served. Polite conversation lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Then Miss Marple came directly to the point. Clara, tell me about your childhood. The question clearly surprised her. My childhood? Yes. Clara laughed uncertainly. I don't see what relevance. Humour me. The baker's wife glanced toward Walter, then shrugged. There isn't much to tell. Try anyway, Clara considered. I grew up in foster house. Miss Marple nodded slowly. An orphanage. Interesting. I never knew my parents. Do you possess any records? Only a few. Birth certificate? Yes. May I see it? The silence that followed felt unusually heavy. Walter frowned. Clara looked confused. Eventually she nodded. I suppose so. She promised to retrieve the document that evening. After she departed, Reed stared at Miss Marple. You think? I think nothing. Which, Reed knew by now, meant exactly the opposite. 3 hours later, Clara returned. The birth certificate rested inside a worn folder. Miss Marple examined it carefully. Name, Clara Ann Hawthorne. Date of birth, December 1941. Place of birth, the same maternity home. The same one listed in Margaret Ashcombe's records. For several moments nobody spoke. Clara looked from one face to another. What is it? Miss Marple folded the document. When were you adopted? At 3 months. Do you know anything about your birth mother? No. The answer came softly. I was told nothing. The room had become very quiet. Walter reached for his wife's hand. Clara stared at Miss Marple. Then understanding began forming. Slowly, painfully. No. The word barely emerged. Surely not. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Facts mattered. Certainty mattered. and certainty had not yet arrived. Nevertheless, the possibility now seemed difficult to ignore. Margaret Ashcombe's daughter, born in 1941, disappeared from official records. Clara Hawthorne, born in 1941, appeared without parental information. The connection was obvious, perhaps too obvious. Miss Marple remained cautious, yet inwardly she acknowledged the likelihood. Margaret Ashcombe had probably been Clara's mother. Later that night, another piece of the puzzle emerged. Harold Vance finally revealed the truth about Michael Trent's final investigation. The conversation occurred in the infirmary. Only Reed and Miss Marple attended. Vance appeared exhausted. The effort of speaking clearly cost him energy. Yet he persisted. Michael found the birth certificate. How? Reed asked. In the warehouse. The answer surprised both listeners. The warehouse? Vance nodded. Hidden among old property records. Suddenly everything made sense. The warehouse purchase. Victor Langley. Old documents. Forgotten files. A birth certificate accidentally preserved for years. What did Michael do? Miss Marple asked. He investigated. Of course. Vance gave a sad smile. Michael couldn't leave things alone. The remark contained affection. Eventually he connected Margaret Ashcombe to Leonard Pierce. How? Leonard had been visiting her. Miss Marple nodded. That much they already knew. Then Michael discovered something else. Vance swallowed. His hands trembled slightly. What? He discovered Leonard wasn't protecting himself. The room became silent. The statement felt important. Very important. Then who was he protecting? Vance closed his eyes. I don't know. Yet this time, Miss Marple suspected he truly did. Or at least suspected. Fear lingered beneath the answer. Fear and guilt. The breakthrough arrived unexpectedly, near midnight, not from investigation, from violence. The telephone rang inside Mrs. Fairchild's cottage. The sound shattered the silence. Miss Marple answered. Sergeant Reed's voice emerged immediately. Urgent. There's been another attack. Her grip tightened. Who? A brief pause followed. Then, Clara Hawthorne. Within minutes, Miss Marple sat inside a police vehicle racing through darkened lanes. The story emerged in fragments. Clara had left the bakery shortly before 11. Walter remained behind cleaning ovens. She never reached home. A passerby discovered her beside a footpath near the churchyard, unconscious, injured, but alive. Someone had struck her from behind. Not a robbery. Nothing had been taken. The intention appeared obvious. Silence her. Permanently. Only luck had prevented success. The realization chilled Miss Marple. Because the attack proved something important. The killer now believed Clara posed an immediate threat. Not Leonard Pierce, not Harold Vance. Clara. Which meant the hidden identity mattered more than the financial fraud, more than the missing money, more than anything else. At the village surgery, Walter sat beside his wife's bed. Relief and fury battled visibly across his face. The doctor expected recovery, no fracture, no lasting injury, only a severe blow to the head. Clara slept peacefully. For now, Miss Marple stood quietly near the window, thinking, observing, reconstructing. The killer had attacked Leonard Pierce, then Harold Vance, now Clara. Each target shared one characteristic: knowledge. Not money. Knowledge. Knowledge about Michael Trent's discovery. Knowledge about Margaret Ashcombe. Knowledge about the hidden birth certificate. Suddenly a possibility entered Miss Marple's mind. A possibility so startling she almost dismissed it. Almost. Yet once considered, it refused to leave. She turned toward Sergeant Reed. Tell me something, yes? Who inherited Margaret Ashcombe's cottage after Clara declined it? The sergeant frowned. What? The cottage? Why does that matter? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Because I have begun to suspect that everyone has been asking the wrong question. What question? Who benefited from Leonard Pierce's death? She looked toward the sleeping Clara, then back at Reed. The correct question may be this. A pause followed. Who benefited from Margaret Ashcombe's silence? For several seconds neither spoke. Outside, church bells marked the hour. Inside, Miss Marple felt the final pieces beginning to move into position. Not enough for certainty, not yet, but enough to glimpse the truth. And when the truth finally arrived, she suspected it would astonish the entire village, including the murderer. Chapter 10. The Cottage on Rose Lane. Monday dawned beneath a pale blue sky. The village appeared calm once more, though it was the uneasy calm that often follows a storm rather than precedes one. News of the attack on Clara Hawthorne spread rapidly. Shock replaced gossip. For the first time since Leonard Pierce's death, many villagers seemed genuinely frightened. A murderer was one thing. A murderer willing to strike repeatedly was another. People locked doors that had remained unlocked for years. Garden gates were fastened. Evening walks became less common. The sense of security that had always surrounded St. Alderwick was beginning to fracture. Clara remained under medical observation. The doctor expected a full recovery, but insisted she rest. Walter refused to leave her side. Miss Marple approved. The attacker had failed. There was no guarantee they would not try again. Meanwhile, Sergeant Reed found himself increasingly overwhelmed by contradictions. Fraud, a hidden birth certificate, an abandoned child, Margaret Ashcombe, Victor Langley, Michael Trent. Each discovery seemed to answer one question, while creating three more. By mid-morning, he found himself once again seated opposite Miss Marple. I feel as though we're looking at a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Most puzzles feel that way until the very end. Do you know who killed Pierce? Not yet. The answer was truthful. Mostly, she knew something more valuable than a name. She knew the shape of the truth, and that shape was becoming increasingly distinct. Together they visited Rosewood Cottage once more. The property stood silent beneath climbing roses and overgrown hedges. Inside, sunlight filtered through dusty windows. The house felt less abandoned than before, perhaps because Miss Marple now understood that Margaret Ashcombe's life mattered profoundly to the mystery. People often focused upon the dead body. Miss Marple preferred focusing upon the hidden story. The hidden story almost always explained the dead body. She returned to the writing desk, then the bookshelf, then the sitting room. Nothing seemed remarkable, until she noticed something she had overlooked previously: a framed embroidery hanging above the fireplace. At first glance it appeared decorative, a simple countryside scene, yet several stitches near the corner had come loose. Curious. Miss Marple removed it carefully. A folded document fell onto the carpet. Sergeant Reed stared. You missed that before? So did I. Miss Marple bent down. The paper appeared old, very old, and heavily worn. She unfolded it, then sat perfectly still. It was a letter, written by Margaret Ashcombe, addressed to no one, apparently never sent. The handwriting trembled slightly. The date immediately attracted attention. 1 year before Michael Trent's death. Miss Marple began reading. The first paragraphs discussed regret, loneliness, mistakes. Then came the passage that changed everything. I have lived too long with this burden. The child deserved better than secrecy. Thomas deserved the truth. Leonard knows everything now, and I fear what he may do with that knowledge. Reed inhaled sharply. Miss Marple continued reading. He says he wishes to protect the family. Perhaps he believes it, yet protection and control often resemble one another more closely than people admit. The room seemed suddenly smaller. The implications expanded rapidly. Leonard Pierce had known the truth, years before Michael Trent discovered it. years before the murders, and Margaret herself had feared him, not because he intended violence, because he controlled information, dangerous information. The remainder of the letter proved even more revealing. Margaret confessed that her daughter had indeed been given away shortly after birth, not out of cruelty, out of fear. Social scandal in 1941 carried consequences, particularly in a village like St. Alderwick. The child had been placed for adoption through private arrangements, records altered, names concealed, the secret buried, for decades. Then came the final paragraph. Miss Marple read it twice, then handed the letter silently to read. The sergeant's eyes widened. The paragraph stated, "If Clara ever learns the truth, she must know that I loved her every day of her life." Silence filled the cottage. Absolute silence. At last there could be little doubt. Margaret Ashcombe had been Clara Hawthorne's mother. Yet the discovery raised an even more troubling question. Why would anyone kill to keep that secret hidden? Reed voiced the question aloud. "I don't understand." "Nor did I," Miss Marple admitted. "Until now." The sergeant waited. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the window. Outside, roses moved gently in the breeze. "The secret itself isn't sufficient." "No, there must be something attached to it." "Such as?" Miss Marple turned. "Identity." The single word hung heavily between them. The answer began emerging from an unexpected source. Harold Vance. Once again. That afternoon the businessman requested another meeting. His recovery continued. So did his conscience. When Miss Marple arrived, he looked exhausted, but determined. "I remembered something." She sat beside him. "What?" Michael's final argument. The words immediately commanded attention. "You heard it." "Part of it." Vance nodded. "Not everything." "Tell me." He swallowed, then spoke slowly. Michael wasn't arguing about fraud. Miss Marple remained silent. She had already suspected as much. He was arguing about Clara. That statement changed everything. Everything. For several moments neither spoke. Then Miss Marple asked, "What exactly did Michael say?" Vance stared at the blanket covering his knees. "He said somebody had a right to know who she really was." The room became very still. "What happened then?" "Leonard refused." "Why?" The answer arrived quietly. "Because exposing the truth would destroy someone." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. At last, at long last, the emotional motive, the personal motive, the missing piece. Returning to St. Alderwick that evening, Miss Marple considered the revelation carefully. Leonard Pierce knew Clara's identity. Michael Trent discovered it. Margaret feared Leonard's control over the information. And someone eventually decided murder was preferable to disclosure. The question was no longer whether Clara was Margaret's daughter. The question was whose daughter she truly was. Because Thomas Pierce's letters contained doubt, not certainty. Doubt, a critical distinction. If Thomas Pierce had not been the father, then who was, and why had the answer remained hidden for nearly 2 decades? Miss Marple suddenly recalled something, a small detail, one that had seemed insignificant at the time. Victor Langley, the vanished businessman, the warehouse owner, the man connected to fraudulent accounts, the man connected to Leonard Pierce, the man who disappeared shortly before the mystery truly began. A strange feeling settled over her. Not certainty, recognition, like seeing the outline of a familiar face through fog. That night, she requested county records concerning Victor Langley. Hours later, the documents arrived. Most proved routine: business licenses, property transactions, correspondence. Then she found a photograph, a clearer photograph than the one from the warehouse. Victor Langley stood beside several associates. One of them was Margaret Ashcombe. The image had been taken in 1940, a year before Clara's birth. Miss Marple stared. then examined it again and again. Something about their expressions troubled her. Not friendship, not business, something more intimate, something personal. A possibility formed immediately, a possibility capable of explaining everything. Margaret's secrecy, Thomas Pierce's doubts, Leonard's fear, Michael Trent's determination, and perhaps even murder. Near midnight, Miss Marple sat alone in the Fairchild garden. The village slept beneath moonlight. For the first time since the investigation began, she felt close to certainty. Very close. Not enough to accuse, not enough to reveal, but enough to understand. The killer had never been protecting money. Money merely complicated matters. The killer had been protecting an identity, a reputation, a family history built upon deception. Michael Trent threatened that deception. Leonard Pierce eventually threatened it too. And Clara Hawthorne, without realizing it, represented the final danger. Miss Marple looked toward the church tower in the distance. The solution hovered just beyond reach. One final piece remained missing, only one, and when it arrived, the entire structure would collapse, including the carefully constructed lies that had survived for nearly 20 years. Somewhere in St. Alderwick, the murderer likely believed the truth remained buried. Miss Marple knew otherwise. The truth was already emerging, slowly, relentlessly, and very soon it would demand an answer. Chapter 11. The Daughter of Two Names. Tuesday morning began with certainty. Not complete certainty. Not the kind that could yet be presented in a courtroom, but the kind Miss Marple trusted most. The certainty that emerged when dozens of seemingly unrelated observations finally arranged themselves into a coherent picture. For days, facts had accumulated, some important, some apparently trivial. Now they were beginning to connect. And once connected, they pointed in only one direction. Miss Marple requested several meetings that morning. The first was with Clara Hawthorne. The baker's wife had recovered sufficiently to leave the surgery, though Walter remained fiercely protective. They met in the bakery before opening. The familiar scent of bread filled the room. For a moment, the setting felt comfortingly ordinary. Then Miss Marple asked, "Clara, did Margaret Ashcombe ever mention Victor Langley?" The effect was immediate. Confusion appeared, then surprise. Once. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Only once? That I remember. What did she say?" Clara thought carefully. "She called him a coward. Interesting. Very interesting. Nothing else?" "No." "Did she seem angry?" The answer came instantly. "Not angry." "Then what?" Clara frowned. "Disappointed." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Disappointment often revealed deeper wounds than anger, particularly when affection once existed. Her second meeting occurred with Harold Vance. The businessman appeared considerably stronger. He also seemed relieved. Years of guilt had begun lifting from his shoulders. "Tell me about Victor Langley." Vance sighed. "I wondered when you'd ask." The answer confirmed much. "What sort of man was he?" "Charming." The response carried obvious disapproval. "People often trusted him. And should they have?" "No." The answer came immediately. Vance stared toward the window. "Victor had a gift." "What gift?" "He convinced people to believe what they wanted to believe." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A dangerous talent. Did Margaret Ashcombe know him well?" The businessman hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Another confirmation. Not proof. Confirmation. Was Victor Langley Clara's father?" The question seemed to strike him physically. For several seconds he simply stared. Then, yes. There it was. At last, the hidden truth. The story emerged gradually. Victor Langley and Margaret Ashcombe had conducted a relationship during the early years of the war. Margaret believed marriage would follow. Victor apparently encouraged the belief. Then came pregnancy. Then complications. Then cowardice. Exactly as Margaret herself had described. When responsibility arrived, Victor disappeared. Not immediately, but effectively. Thomas Pierce eventually entered the situation. He genuinely cared for Margaret, perhaps even loved her, yet doubts persisted, questions remained unanswered, and the relationship collapsed beneath them. A tragedy repeated countless times throughout history, one built not upon cruelty alone, but silence. Miss Marple listened carefully, then asked the question that mattered most. When did Leonard Pierce discover the truth? About 15 years ago. The answer surprised her. Earlier than expected. Much earlier. And? Vance rubbed his forehead. He became obsessed. Obsessed with protecting the family name. There it was again. Protection. The word everyone used. The word Margaret herself had questioned. Protection and control often resemble one another more closely than people admit. Leonard believed disclosure would disgrace his father. Miss Marple considered. The explanation made sense, yet not entirely. Something still felt incomplete. The missing piece arrived unexpectedly, not through investigation, through memory. Late that afternoon, Miss Marple sat in Mrs. Fairchild's garden reviewing everything she had learned. Children's voices drifted from the village green. A dog barked somewhere nearby. The ordinary sounds of life continued. Then suddenly she remembered a sentence, a single sentence, one spoken by Harold Vance days earlier. Leonard wasn't protecting himself. At the time, the remark seemed puzzling. Now it became clear. Leonard wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting someone else. Someone still alive, someone directly connected to Victor Langley. Miss Marple sat very still. Then another observation followed. Victor Langley vanished. No confirmed death, no body, no grave, only disappearance. The realization struck with surprising force. What if Victor Langley had never truly vanished? That evening she requested old county photographs. Several hours later they arrived. She spread them across a table. Business functions, community events, warehouse openings, agricultural fairs. Faces filled every image. Hundreds of faces. Miss Marple examined them patiently. Then suddenly she saw it. Not a face, a habit, a gesture, a particular way of standing. The same posture appeared repeatedly, decades apart, different names, different ages, yet identical. She felt a quiet certainty settle over her. The answer had been present all along, hidden in plain sight, just as such answers often were. Meanwhile, Sergeant Reed pursued another matter. The attack on Clara had yielded a small piece of evidence. A witness. An elderly gardener named Frederick Miles. The man had been returning home when he noticed movement near the churchyard. "I couldn't see much," Reed encouraged him patiently. "What did you see?" "A man." "What man?" "I don't know." "Can you describe him?" Miles frowned. "Medium height. Not especially useful. Anything else?" The gardener hesitated, then nodded. He limped. Reed's attention sharpened immediately. A limp. At last, something concrete, a physical characteristic. Not many villagers possessed one. The list narrowed dramatically. That night, Miss Marple finally assembled the entire chain. Michael Trent discovered fraud. While investigating, he found evidence concerning Clara's birth. He learned Victor Langley, not Thomas Pierce, was her father. He confronted Leonard Pierce. Leonard refused disclosure. The argument intensified. Then Michael died. Officially, a motor accident. In reality, almost certainly murder. Years passed. Leonard maintained silence. Margaret Ashcombe remained silent. Harold Vance remained silent. Then Clara accidentally discovered Michael's hidden records. The secret resurfaced. Leonard became frightened. Someone else became desperate. And finally Leonard Pierce died beneath the church bell. The sequence now made perfect sense. Almost. One final question remained. Why wait 3 years after Michael Trent's death? Why kill Leonard Pierce now? The answer arrived shortly before midnight, and it came from Clara herself. She appeared unexpectedly at Mrs. Fairchild's cottage. Walter accompanied her. The baker's wife carried something in her hands. A small notebook, one Miss Marple had never seen before. I found it inside Margaret's cottage. Miss Marple accepted it carefully. The notebook contained personal reflections. Most were ordinary. Then she reached the final pages. Her eyes widened, because Margaret had written an entry only weeks before her death. And within that entry appeared a devastating revelation. Margaret had finally decided to tell Clara the truth. Not eventually, not someday. Immediately, she had written letters, gathered documents, prepared evidence. She intended to reveal everything. Then she died unexpectedly before doing so. Miss Marple closed the notebook slowly. At last, the timing, the missing explanation, everything became clear. Someone learned Margaret intended disclosure. Someone realized the secret was no longer safe. Michael Trent discovered it soon afterward. Then Michael died. The motive had never vanished. It had merely waited, dormant, until Clara's discovery threatened exposure once again. For a long time nobody spoke. Finally Reed broke the silence. "You know who did it." It was not a question. Miss Marple looked toward the window. Moonlight illuminated the garden. Beyond it lay the sleeping village, a village that would soon awaken to a terrible truth. Yes. The word emerged quietly. Clara inhaled sharply. Walter stared. Even Reed seemed momentarily unsettled. "Who?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Tomorrow." The answer surprised everyone. "Tomorrow?" "Yes." She smiled faintly. "The murderer has spent years manipulating appearances." Her gaze settled upon the notebook. "One more day will make no difference." A pause followed. Then, "But I would very much like to see their face when they realize the game is over." Outside, the church clock struck midnight. The sound echoed softly across St. Alderwick. For the first time since Leonard Pierce died beneath the fallen bell, Miss Marple knew exactly where the investigation would end. Not in the warehouse, not in the churchyard, not in Margaret Ashcombe's cottage. It would end where all such mysteries truly ended, with human nature, and with a person who had spent years believing a lie was worth more than a life. Tomorrow, that belief would finally be exposed. Chapter 12. Tea with a Murderer. Wednesday afternoon arrived warm and bright. Miss Marple had chosen the venue carefully. Not the church hall, not the police station, not Rosewood Cottage. Instead, she selected Mrs. Brindle's tea room. The choice puzzled Sergeant Reed until she explained, "Murderers expect drama, and I prefer discomfort." The tea room offered precisely that. It was impossible to maintain composure while surrounded by teacups, sponge cakes, and polite conversation, especially when one's secrets were about to be revealed. By 3 o'clock, the invited guests had assembled. Sergeant Reed sat near the fireplace. Clara and Walter Hawthorne occupied a table together. Harold Vance appeared pale but determined. Mrs. Fairchild attended as a silent observer. Several others arrived as requested. People connected to the mystery, people connected to the past, and one person who believed they had successfully hidden the truth for years. Miss Marple took her seat. For a few moments she stirred her tea. No one spoke. The silence stretched. Then she began. "I have often observed that secrets are rather like weeds." Several faces looked puzzled. "If neglected, they grow." A few faint smiles appeared. None belonged to the murderer. Eventually they become impossible to control. She folded her hands. "That is precisely what happened in St. Alderwick." The story unfolded calmly, methodically. Miss Marple disliked theatrical accusations. Facts worked perfectly well on their own. Many people assumed Leonard Pierce died because of financial fraud. She glanced toward Harold Vance. That was certainly part of the story. Vance nodded miserably. The fraud was real. Yes, Miss Marple continued. Victor Langley created it. Several listeners exchanged glances. The name had acquired almost mythical qualities during the investigation. The vanished businessman, the ghost behind everything. The fraud provided motive for fear. She paused. But not for murder. Sergeant Reed nodded slowly. He already knew where this was leading. The true motive involved identity. Now the room became very quiet. Miss Marple looked toward Clara. "Margaret Ashcombe was your mother." The statement landed gently. Clara lowered her eyes. By now the revelation no longer shocked her. It saddened her, nothing more. A pause, but uncertainty destroyed that relationship. She glanced around the room. Eventually Clara was adopted. Walter squeezed his wife's hand. She returned the gesture. Miss Marple reached for a small folder. Inside were several photographs. She placed one upon the table. Victor Langley, young, confident, smiling. Then she placed another beside it. Taken many years later. A different name, a different life, yet unmistakably the same man. Gasps emerged around the room. Because the face belonged to someone they all knew. Someone who had lived among them for years. Someone who had never vanished at all. Miss Marple looked directly across the room, at Arthur Bellamy, the retired warehouse clerk, the elderly man who had voluntarily assisted the investigation, the man everyone trusted, the man who remembered everything. Bellamy's face did not change immediately. That was perhaps the most revealing thing of all. No surprise, no confusion, only resignation. Sergeant Reed spoke quietly. Victor Langley. Bellamy closed his eyes. For several moments nobody moved. Then the old man sighed. A long, weary sigh. Eventually someone was bound to notice. The confession emerged almost peacefully. Several people stared in disbelief. Harold Vance looked physically ill. Clara simply looked astonished. Miss Marple continued gently. "After the fraud became dangerous, you disappeared." Bellamy nodded. "I changed my name. You changed your life." "Yes. You remained close enough to monitor events." Another nod. The explanation followed. Years earlier, Michael Trent uncovered the fraudulent accounts. While tracing old records, he discovered documents concerning Clara's birth. Those documents led him to Victor Langley, and eventually to Arthur Bellamy. Michael confronted him inside the warehouse, the very argument Bellamy later described to investigators, because Bellamy himself had been present, not as a witness, as the man being confronted. The realization spread through the room. Everything suddenly aligned. Every contradiction, every half-truth, every convenient memory. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Michael intended exposure. Bellamy stared at the table. Yes, not merely of the fraud. No, the identity fraud. A faint smile appeared. A sad one. That would have ruined everything. There it was. The motive. Not greed, not revenge. Fear. Fear of losing the carefully constructed life he had built. A fear that had lasted decades. "What happened?" Reed asked. Bellamy answered immediately. For the first time, complete honesty entered his voice. "I begged him to stop." Silence filled the room. He refused. Then? Bellamy looked very old suddenly. "I followed him the next evening." No one spoke. The road was empty. His hands trembled. "I only meant to frighten him." Miss Marple said nothing. Neither did anyone else. Bellamy swallowed. The car left the road. A long pause followed. Then, "I never intended." The sentence remained unfinished. No one believed it completely. Perhaps not even Bellamy. Michael Trent died because he would not remain silent. That much was now undeniable. But Leonard Pierce survived. Miss Marple continued. Bellamy nodded. Leonard knew. And kept the secret. Yes. The old man's voice contained bitterness. Because exposing me would expose his father. Exactly. Leonard's motives had always been complicated. Not innocence, not guilt. Loyalty. Misguided loyalty. The kind that often creates disaster. For years, the arrangement endured. Then Clara discovered Michael Trent's hidden records. The secret resurfaced. Leonard panicked. Harold Vance grew frightened. And Arthur Bellamy realized history was repeating itself. The same threat, the same danger, the same possibility of exposure. Only now he was older, more vulnerable, and far more desperate. Miss Marple looked directly at him. You sabotaged the church platform. Bellamy closed his eyes. Yes. The admission arrived quietly. No denial, no resistance, only exhaustion. You knew Leonard would stand beneath the bell. Yes. You planned it weeks in advance. Yes. The room seemed frozen. Even the teacups remained untouched. And Harold Vance? Reed asked. Bellamy nodded. He knew too much. The warehouse stairs? Yes. And Clara? A flicker of emotion crossed his face. Regret, perhaps, or shame. Possibly both. She wouldn't stop asking questions. The answer emerged barely above a whisper. For several moments nobody spoke. Then Clara finally found her voice. Why? The single word carried enormous weight. Bellamy looked toward her. For the first time, genuine sorrow appeared. Not for Leonard, not for Michael, for Clara. You were never supposed to know. The answer sounded absurdly inadequate, yet he seemed to mean it. You had a good life. Clara stared. My mother spent her entire life alone. Bellamy flinched. The words struck home. My father abandoned her. Another flinch. And people died protecting a lie. Silence followed. Bellamy possessed no response. None existed. Eventually Sergeant Reed stood. The moment had arrived. No drama, no struggle, only inevitability. Arthur Bellamy rose slowly. His shoulders sagged. The fight had left him. Perhaps years earlier, perhaps decades. The handcuffs seemed almost unnecessary. Before leaving, however, he turned toward Miss Marple. You noticed the photograph. It was not a question. Miss Marple smiled gently. Not the photograph. Bellamy looked surprised. What then? Your posture. The old man blinked. Posture? People change names more easily than habits. For the first time, Bellamy laughed. A quiet laugh, almost appreciative. Then he allowed Reed to lead him away. The tea room remained silent after his departure. No one quite knew what to say. The mystery had ended. Yet satisfaction felt strangely absent. Human tragedies rarely produced satisfying endings, only truthful ones. Eventually Harold Vance spoke. I should have told the truth years ago. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. No comfort, no contradiction, simply truth. Later that evening, Clara visited Rosewood Cottage alone. The property now belonged to her. Legally, emotionally, perhaps spiritually, sunset painted the garden gold. For a long while she sat in Margaret Ashcombe's old chair, thinking, remembering, imagining. A mother she never knew, a life that might have been, questions that would never receive answers. Yet one answer remained. Margaret had loved her. That much was certain, and sometimes certainty mattered more than explanation. As they always did, Miss Marple prepared for her journey home. Mrs. Fairchild accompanied her to the gate. A dreadful business. Yes. Do such things happen everywhere? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Human nature happens everywhere. The answer seemed sufficient. She glanced once more toward the quiet village. A place of roses, tea, gossip, kindness, loneliness, loyalty, deception, and murder. Not unusual at all, merely human. And in Miss Marple's experience, there was nothing in the world more mysterious than that. Epilogue. Bread at dawn. Several months later, the first customers arrived at Hawthorne's bakery before sunrise. The scent of fresh bread drifted through the street. Clara stood behind the counter, peaceful, not entirely healed, perhaps never entirely healed, but stronger. A framed photograph rested on a nearby shelf. Margaret Ashcombe, placed there quietly, without explanation, without ceremony. Those who understood said nothing. Those who did not ask questions received simple answers. Life moved forward, as life always does. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple sat beside a window with her knitting, observing, listening, understanding.